There's a large number of different types of biases. And in this class, I'm only going to cover just a few, but they say that there's probably over 200. The biggest one we kind of are familiar with is structural or systemic bias, and that's like policies and practices that exist throughout an whole society, for example. And it can result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or hurtful advantage to others, not advantage, hurtful treatment to others based on their background or looks. We can see this on the news at night, claims of criminal injustice based on people's background or their color or their race or their religion. We also see that people have been hurt or killed, or there's been horrible things that have happened because of people and their race and their background and their color and their religion. We also have seen things that have gone great. For example, over 50 years ago, someone in a wheelchair, for example, couldn't even go down the block or get into so many buildings. And we've created policies and laws to help eliminate some of those barriers for people that have challenges like people being in a wheelchair. We have institutional biases. That's like policies, rules, practices, procedures about how an organization works. One way you can see that is if you look at their hiring and firing practices. Do they have a diverse work group? There's internalized bias. That can be conscious and unconscious. It's like acceptance of a racial hierarchy. And the one way I can explain that is because I always thought I would get much farther if I was a guy. So a lot of times if I used to apply for jobs, I would use my nickname Nat instead of my name Natalie, because sometimes I'd be applying for jobs that were primarily taken by men or the way they would hire men. And so sometimes there's stereotypes. Then there's also interpersonal discrimination. That's like encounters between individuals. And that's like when people do things that are rude to people, even in their organization, if they are different. They might they might be treated poorly, or remember in the olden days, people used to tell jokes at the office or in schools or wherever you were. And they would be jokes that would be based on, for example, blondes, So they would call them blonde jokes, and they were making the assumption in the joke that a blonde wasn't as capable as somebody who wasn't blonde. That would be another example of that. Then there's confirmation bias. That would be similar to what we talked about earlier. If somebody has heard that the French people are rude, and then they go to a bakery and the French person is rude, confirmation bias, they see that French person was rude, so all French people are rude. That would be called confirmation bias. So it's like a generalization that goes even farther. And then there's direct discrimination. That's when somebody's treated blatantly unfavorably because of a protected class. It can happen when there's a connection to someone who has a particular characteristic. So an office might, like my example earlier, might hire a guy over a woman because even though she might be more qualified, he's a guy, it's kind of more accepted for him. He just thinks that would be a better fit for the company. Whatever. And then there's indirect discrimination. That would be when everything seems neutral and fair for everyone. There's policies, there's stuff in place, but it does disadvantage a group of people, even though it doesn't affect, for example, the job. Like an example would be in the olden days, in order to be a flight attendant, you had to have be a certain height and weight, and that didn't make it that you had better qualifications for doing the job. That's just what they decided, to eliminate people, and that would be a sign of discrimination. So there's over 200 different types of biases, and so maybe that gives you an idea that there's just more than the ones I've already discussed. And we have to be really careful to treat people fairly, no matter what their issue is, no matter what kind of background they have, and look at our own biases and maybe even the bias of our clients, so we can, and people we work with, so we can see where we might be affecting somebody's decision.